Do you think people are inherently good, or do we all have good and evil in us that basically everyone is capable of evil based on the environment?
Certainly, most of us have potential for both good and evil. I'm not prepared to say that everyone is capable of evil. That maybe some people who, even in the worst of circumstances, would not be capable of it. But most of us are very susceptible to environmental influences. So when we look at things that we were talking about previously, let's say what the Nazis did during the Holocaust, I think it's quite difficult to say, I know that I would not have done those things, even if I were in the same circumstances as those who did them. Even if, let's say, I had grown up under the Nazi regime, had been indoctrinated with racist ideas, had also had the idea that I must obey orders, follow the commands of the Führer, plus, of course, perhaps the threat that if I didn't do certain things, I might get sent to the Russian front, and that would be a pretty grim fate. I think it's really hard for anybody to say, nevertheless, I know I would not have killed those Jews or whatever else it was.
Well, what's your intuition? How many people will be able to say that?
Truly to be able to say it. I think very few, less than 10%.
To me, it seems a very interesting and powerful thing to meditate on. So I've read a lot about the war, World War II, and I can't escape the thought that I would have not been one of the 10%.
Right. I have to say, I simply don't know. I would like to hope that I would have been one of the 10%, but I don't really have any basis for claiming that I would have been different from the majority. Is it a worthwhile thing to contemplate? It would be interesting if we could find a way of really finding these answers. There obviously is quite a bit of research on people during the Holocaust, on how ordinary Germans got led to do terrible things, and there are also studies of the resistance, some heroic people in the White Rose group, for example, who resisted even though they knew they were likely to die for it. But I don't know whether these studies really can answer your larger question of how many people would have been capable of doing that.
Well, sort of the reason I think it's interesting is in the world, as you've described, when there are things that you'd like to do that are good, that are objectively good, it's useful to think about whether I'm not willing to do something, or I'm not willing to acknowledge something as good and the right thing to do because I'm simply scared of putting my life, of damaging my life in some kind of way. And that kind of thought exercise is helpful to understand what is the right thing in my current skill set and the capacity to do. Sort of, there's things that are convenient, and I wonder if there are things that are highly inconvenient, where I would have to experience derision or hatred or death or all those kinds of things, but it is truly the right thing to do. And that kind of balance is, I feel like in America we don't have. It's difficult to think in the current times. It seems easier to put yourself back in history, where you can sort of objectively contemplate how willing you are to do the right thing when the cost is high.
True, but I think we do face those challenges today, and I think we can still ask ourselves those questions. So one stand that I took more than 40 years ago now was to stop eating meat, become a vegetarian at a time when you hardly met anybody who was a vegetarian, or if you did, they might have been a Hindu, or they might have had some weird theories about meat and health. And I know, thinking about making that decision, I was convinced that it was the right thing to do, but I still did have to think, are all my friends going to think that I'm a crank because I'm now refusing to eat meat? So, I'm not saying there were any terrible sanctions, obviously, but I thought about that, and I guess I decided, well, I still think this is the right thing to do, and if I'll put up with that if it happens. And one or two friends were clearly uncomfortable with that decision, but that was pretty minor compared to the historical examples that we've been talking about. But other issues that we have around too, like global poverty and what we ought to be doing about that, is another question where people, I think, can have the opportunity to take a stand on what's the right thing to do now. Climate change would be a third question where, again, people are taking a stand. You can look at Greta Thunberg there and say, well, I think it must have taken a lot of courage for a schoolgirl to say, I'm going to go on strike about climate change and see what happened.
Yeah, especially in this divisive world, she gets exceptionally huge amounts of support and hatred both.
That's right.
Which is very difficult for a teenager to operate in.